Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff, too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
He was extraordinarily talented.
The best at what he did.
Back to pass goes Namath, throws deep down the middle.
Subsequent generations didn't know that Marty had been an athlete, and a terrific one.
Before any of us, you had the great Marty Glickman.
You can't say 36 Olympics without thinking of Adolf Hitler and what the U.S. did to Marty Glickman.
The first jock-turned-broadcaster in the history of our medium.
The crowd all rising, pounding on the seat.
He invented the vernacular.
It's a key.
The lane.
Swish.
Swish. Swish.
Marty embedded the game into the consciousness of America.
Good, like Nedicks.
I would talk like him. I'd walk like him.
High enough, deep enough, and it is good.
What Marty did for these kids and these programs was unprecedented.
Remember the name, Wilt Chamberlain. Into the lower turn, Overtrick on the outside now has taken the lead. Where does he go? Moving downfield and killing the clock. That's what the Giants have to do. The handoff goes to Coy, double reverse, a triple reverse. It goes to Tarkenton finally. Tarkenton throws to Morrison. Morrison has got the ball. It's down to the 10, the 5, touchdown! Touchdown! A triple reverse on a pass by Tarkenton. Wow! That's the kind of a play you make up on the streets or in the playground or your backyard. The kids make them up. A triple reverse. Wow.
He changed the landscape of sports and television as we know it today.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, hopefully this week's episode is as good as Nedicks as well. My name is Tim Hanlon. How are you? It is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is, of course, devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. We appreciate it as always. As you know, on this show, we go deep into teams and leagues and various competitions and all those kind of things that are no longer with us for whatever reasons. And we certainly try to stretch into the various supporting actors and situations around those stories. And Lord knows sports broadcasting fits that criteria very well and is a topic and a set of interviews that we've gone very deep on here on this show. And a wonderful opportunity this week to go back into that subgenre, shall we say, with our guest this week, Jeffrey Gurock, who is the author of a wonderful new biography of the great broadcasting legend, and I think legend is got to be with a capital L in this case, Marty Glickman. The book is called Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend. And as you heard in that trailer there, which is what it was, the clip that started our show, it is a trailer for the absolutely awesome 2013 documentary from HBO called simply Glickman, produced and written and directed by James Friedman. And that is, it barely scratches the surface of just how amazing and awesome and pervasive Marty Glickman was on the airwaves in the New York metropolitan area and nationally, for that matter, depending on where you were looking and listening. But let me give you a little bit of a hint of that comprehensiveness in New York sports broadcasting lore and history. Let me read to you a passage from another book, this one by David Halberstam, that came out in 1999 called Sports on New York Radio, a play-by-play history. Perhaps the essential tome on how sports and New York grew up together on the radio. This is from his synopsis in the back, talking about Marty Glickman. Marty's contributions to New York play-by-play are endless. College basketball fans of the 1940s and 1950s remember his gripping calls of City College's double championship. Early Knicks fans won't forget the cries of swish crackling the airwaves. Fans of the 1960s swear by Marty's riveting play-by-play of the great football giant teams at a time when all home games were blacked out on television. Jets fans of the 1970s, late 80s, and early 1990s also absorbed his graphic and robust play calling. Glickman has influenced the careers of so many, including people like Johnny Most, Marv Albert, Spencer Ross, and Dick Stockton. And that itself is just hard to encapsulate just how broad, pervasive, and influential the dulcet tones of Marty Glickman were on the sports broadcasting landscape over those decades. Yes, those teams, but others like the Rangers and the New York Nets of the ABA, Paramount news reels back in the day when that was the best and only way to get deep sports coverage beyond one's newspaper was to go to the theater and see the newsreels that Marty Glickman was narrating. Yonkers Raceway, Fordham basketball, home box office. Marty Glickman was the first sports director for home box office back in the early 70s. And it goes on and on and on. Even Olympics coverage, and which is an interesting twist because, again, as the title of Jeffrey Gurock's book subtitle, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend, the Jewish component is absolutely a large thread in this biography, in this story, and it goes back to the Olympics because, for those who don't know or didn't know, beyond just the gigantic career in broadcasting that Marty Glickman had, this man, Marty Glickman, was a phenomenal athlete back in the 1930s, playing football and basketball at Syracuse University, but also as a track and field star and a member of the 1936 Olympic team that went to Berlin. And as we'll get into our conversation, the story of how Marty and why Marty was chosen and then ultimately not allowed to compete during those, shall we call them, interesting games. If you're a student of history, you'll know the environment in which those 1936 Olympic Games were played and the tool, if you will, that they were to that of a burgeoning government and the evil that sort of came out of that. This is an amazing story, an amazing biography of an amazing person who had many lives, an athletic career of amazing world-class and Hall of Fame-worthy components, and a broadcasting career that went even further, I would suggest, in the hearts and minds of many, many New Yorkers of a certain age and beyond in the realm of sports. This is the story, the conversation of the great Marty Glickman with our guest this week, Jeffrey Gurock, he the author of the new biography called Marty Glickman. And we encourage you, of course, to find the book for yourselves and enjoy it, as I'm sure you will after hearing this conversation. The best way, of course, and the most helpful way for us is to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. All you have to do is search up this episode, numbered 323, with our guest, Jeffrey Gurock, and you will find a convenient link or two to said book. And when you do so, in that general direction, you will be giving us a couple of shekels of referral love, and we appreciate that. That helps keep our lights on, he says, and we appreciate that to no end, and you will enjoy the book thoroughly, of course. Well, let's not waste any more time, shall we? Let's delve right in to the story of Marty Glickman. An amazing story. You will enjoy it thoroughly. And as always, we encourage you to please enjoy. As a native New Yorker, okay, mm-hmm. I can relate to this story very much, but maybe for our audience, you can give a little bit of background about you, your entree to the story about this guy, Marty Glickman, and maybe as a kicker, why, if you didn't grow up in New York, why is Marty Glickman so important in in the sports realm if you grew up in New York?
Sure. So I sound like a New Yorker. I'm 73 years old. I was one of these kids who grew up listening to Marty Glickman, who was the voice of the Giants, football Giants, and the Knicks, and he did college basketball, etc. And I was one of these kids who would listen to him at night under the covers with a transistor radio with a plug in my ear to listen to Marty Glickman. When I played ball in the streets, if I made a jump shot, a good basket, I would say swish, just like Marty did. Before Marv Albert, his prime disciple, said yes, and before Iron Eagle said book it, and before Mike Breen said bang, we had the voice of Marty Glickman, which resonated with me constantly in my life. Also, one time Marty Glickman was broadcasting a game, and the game was very close, and he said during a timeout, he said to the fans, open your windows and shout, go Giants, go, go Giants, go. And this is before Howard Beale opened the window in network and screamed, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And then I had a friend, I still have this friend, who one time was driving on the Sawmill River Parkway in Westchester, which is north of the Bronx, where I grew up. And it was a very close game. It was a 2-minute warning for football fans. And Marty says, Giant fans within the sound of my voice, pull off the road. I don't want to cause any accidents. And I thought my friend was just making up the story until I found 2 or 3 other sources where people recalled that one of the guys was Mike Burke, who ended up being the president of the New York Yankees. He said he was on the Sawmill River Parkway and he pulled off the road. And then there's a guy, Dave Cohen, who became an announcer, and he did the Yankee games in 1980s, and he was driving on Flatbush Avenue, and he was in the left lane, and Glickman's admonition is, pull off the road. He weaved his way over three lanes to hear Marty Glickman talk. So all these things were part of the voice of my youth as a kid growing up in New York. I was also proud of the fact and gratified that Marty Glickman took some time to broadcast not only professional sports and college sports. He did 2,000 broadcasts of varying times, but he also did the high school football game of the week in the 50s and 60s at the time. And not only did he do the game, but at halftime, he would interview the head of the GO, general organization, the choir, music kids, because he wanted to make the point that New York kids were good and that the gang warfare that Leonard Bernstein captured in West Side Story wasn't the whole story. But you asked me why someone who's not a New Yorker would be interested in this story. And the fact of the matter is, one of my chapters is called Marty as Mentor. So many of the great announcers today were disciples of Marty Glickman. People like Bob Costas, Len Berman, Iron Eagle, who I mentioned a moment ago. Marty also was the first teacher of Gail Serens, the first woman to broadcast a NFL game. And just last week, Beth Mowens was broadcasting a game. She's a student, a disciple of Marty Glickman. So if you listen to broadcasts around the country, you will hear people who are educated, trained, and motivated by Marty Glickman. And this may surprise your listeners. One of the people who is most dedicated to Marty Glickman's memory and sees him as one of the great influences of his life was a basketball player who grew up and was famous in California. His name was Bill Walton of the great UCLA teams. And when I interviewed him, and Tim, I want to tell you how I end up speaking to all these people. Once I get the name and the email of one of these people, I interview them and I ask them, and I send them an email and I say, my name is Jeff Gurock. I'm a professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University. I have a contract with NYU Press, and then in big letters, and I'm not looking for any money. And that opens the door to speak to them. And after I speak to them, I say, is there anybody else I should speak to? So one of the fellows says, you got to speak to Bill Walton. So with a certain degree of trepidation, I email Bill Walton, and he gets back to me in 1 hour. And he says, Jeff, I need to talk to you. Now, it takes a while for us to connect. He says, Marty Glickman, this little guy, because Marty Glickman was short and Bill Walton was 7 foot tall, was one of the most influential people in my entire life. And I was somewhat stunned by that. Almost the equivalent of John Wooden, his coach at UCLA. I said, well, what's the significance? And Walton said, you probably don't know this, but I stammered and stuttered as a youngster. And I never did interviews until I met Marty Glickman. And Glickman also stuttered as a kid. So Glickman worked with him. He taught him, and now he's a foremost college announcer. And here's a funny ending to the story. When Glickman died in 2001, a obituary writer interviewed John Wooden, again, this legendary great coach. And he said, well, what do you think of Marty Glickman? And Walton said, and Wooden said, oh, he was okay. Just okay. And here's the punchline. He said he taught Bill Walton to speak, and now he never shuts up. That's how my chapter ends. So if you're interested in the history of broadcasting in America, it's not only a New York story, it's a national story. And to go back a step, who influenced Glickman to be a great announcer? None other than Red Barber, who was an announcer for the Yankees, and told him, when you articulate, don't speak so fast, maybe slower than I'm speaking now, and you'll capture the audience. So again, it is a New York story. Glickman said, I'm as New York can be, but there's much more to that than a New York story. It's a national story. And Tim, as we go along, I'm also going to tell you it's a very Jewish story, and it's a story of minority group life in America, which transcends the issue of how good an announcer he really was. So that's just the beginning of the importance of Marty Glickman.
No, absolutely, and I want to get back to that part of it and the origin story of it in a second. So we'll definitely get to that. But it's just ironic that we're having this conversation because next week's episode, as we're recording this, is with the great Marv Albert's son, Kenny Albert.
Right.
We reminisce about a few interesting defunct pit stops in his career. But talk about I know Marv is sort of, I guess, generally considered as one of, if not the most of Marty's most famous proteges. But it's not just about him, right? The Albert family is almost like sort of like the I don't know, the first family, if you will, of sports broadcasting these days, right?
The Kennedys of broadcasting, I mean, multi-generational, that's for sure. Yeah, that's for sure. I have to tell you, Tim, it was a thrill for me and for my editors. We got Marv Albert's email address, and we sent him an email, and the publicist wrote, Dear Marv, a lot of people have forgotten Marty Glickman, but people haven't forgotten you, and we'd like to have you be part of Jeff Gurock's book. And a few hours later, I got an email from my publisher, and she said, holy crap, but it wasn't holy crap because this is a family show. She says, guess who just called me? It's Marv Albert. And he was kind enough to read the manuscript, and he wrote a lovely blurb for the book. And again, I never met Marv Albert, but as a kid, I listened to his broadcasts all the time. Most importantly, the 1977 championship game between the Knicks and the LA Lakers. So Marv Albert, yeah, and Kenny Albert and others. The three Albert brothers, if I'm not mistaken, and all of them were in broadcasting. And I have a considerable amount of information about Albert growing up. And he grew up as Marvin Alfritic. but changed his name to Marv Albert because who in the world could pronounce that name? But name change is also part of the story, which perhaps we'll talk about as we go along.
No, absolutely, and indeed, I do want to get back to that because you do sort of have a pretty touching and interesting sort of a dynamic in a couple of spaces in the book. But I just want to go back to the New York part of it for a second because now I grew up as I'm slightly younger than you are, but I grew up essentially as a child of the 70s. That's sort of when I sort of came into my consciousness, I guess, as a sports fan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it is just, and a little bit of Marty's calls were still in my head, and I could still remember the sound and the intonation and that kind of stuff. But it was definitely near the sort of the near the end of his years, and obviously me, thinking about getting out of New York and going to college and all that kind of stuff. But it is amazing, especially if you're not from New York, to recognize that this is a guy who, I mean, we talked with Kenny about sort of being sort of his new book is called A Mic for All Seasons. I mean, this is a guy who was not only ubiquitous, but also just well-versed, it seemed, in just about every sport or every event that he broadcast. This guy was the voice of the New York Knicks on and off for 21 years, the New York Football Giants for 23 years. He called New York Jets games for 11 years. He did post-game and pre-game stuff and ancillary stuff for the Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. I mean, this guy was even the first broadcaster for the then fledgling, I guess they were called the New York Americans before they became the Nets, right?
The Americans. Yeah, the Jersey right? Americans, ABA, absolutely.
There you go. So it is, plus a whole other sort of hefty dollop of New York related stuff, Yonkers Raceway and all that kind of stuff. So it is, I mean, there is no telling the story about professional and even collegiate sports in New York that does not have at least a handful of chapters about Marty Glickman.
He estimated that he did 2,000 broadcasts, and you mentioned doing trotters from Yonkers Raceway. He also did wrestling matches. He even did a rodeo in South Jersey. You name it. And every sport, he said that one of the most difficult events for him is when he broadcast a game to a group of blind people who obviously couldn't see the action. And interestingly, your listeners probably know that until in the 1950s and early 60s, the NFL games, the home games of the Giants were blacked out because they want people to go to the games. So you couldn't go to the game unless you drove 50 or 60 miles from New York to Connecticut to watch the game on Channel 3 in New Haven. So in lieu of that, people listened to Marty Glickman on the radio. And Tim, I have a family story as part of this. My aunt and uncle lived in Yorktown Heights, New York, which was about 50 miles north of the Bronx. And when the Giants were playing at home, we would say to our mother, "You want to visit your brother today?" We'd jump in the car and we'd go up to Yorktown Heights, turn on the TV, and watch the game from New Haven. But we didn't listen to the voice of the broadcaster on the TV. We turned on the radio so we could have the best of all possible worlds, namely the picture from New Haven and the voice of Marty Glickman. So he was everywhere. If people are interested, if you go to YouTube, you can see a game that Marty Glickman broadcasted in 1968, a playoff game between Princeton and Columbia for the Ivy League championship. And Columbia was led by Jim McMillan, who became a great pro for the Lakers, and Hayward Dotson, and Dave Newmark, who played in the NBA and the ABA. And Princeton, Bill Bradley had graduated already, but Jeff Petrie was playing and some other NBA people. So if you want to hear Marty Glickman's voice again and again and see him, you can go on YouTube and watch him. In addition, in doing my research, I went to a marvelous museum in New York City called the Paley, Paley Museum of Broadcasting. And I sat and I listened to broadcasts that Marty Glickman did to hear his voice again and again. And as a Jewish scholar, I was intrigued by the fact that occasionally Marty Glickman threw in Yiddish words more than just Meshuggah that a lot of people know. Speaking to his Jewish audience, I mean, he was someone who, as a Jew, we were so proud of someone of that sort who was so famous and so important. But, you know, he was a multicultural guy. And again, when he did those high school games, he wasn't doing Jewish games. He was doing public school games. And he was throwing a bouquet to the youngsters in the city of New York. So that's Marty Glickman.
Yeah, not unlike a wink and a nod to, and frankly, it speaks to the melting pot that is for years, many hundreds of years, has been that of the New York City metropolitan area. It's always been a melting pot of all kinds of ethnicities, Jewish, Italian, Irish, even prior, otherwise, and on, still today. And in many respects, it's he was such a reflection, I think. Not just of one ethnic background and group, but frankly all, if you will, if you think about it. And it's one team in that case for the city and the pride that's all part of that stuff. So you could not be more emblematic than a guy like him being so ubiquitous for sports in New York.
You know, one of the saddest moments in his broadcasting career, by his own admission, was in 1951 when you had that first point shaving scandal involving City College of New York, which was the Jewish University of the city. And a year earlier, City College had pulled off the greatest upset in NCAA history when they won both the NIT and the NCAA. And New Yorkers were just so happy that their team had won. And then in 1951, you had this basketball scandal involving City College. And Glickman wrote in one of his memoirs, "How could I not have known this? I knew all these guys. I knew them from the neighborhood. We drank malted milks together. These were our guys." And he was very chagrined about it. And sadly, it also reflected on a portion of his early life where his father was arrested and spent some time in jail because of a corruption scandal involving his business. So it affected Marty very strongly because it was an attack against that city of New York, which he loved so much.
All right, let me talk to you about DraftKings Sportsbook. Hey, NBA fans, the wait is over. Basketball is back, and DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA, is celebrating with an unbeatable offer. New customers can score $200 instantly in bonus bets for throwing down $5 on the NBA. Win or lose, it doesn't matter. You'll start the season with an instant dub. And with DraftKings parlays, everyone's got a shot at even bigger basketball wins. String together multiple bets from the same game or build your parlay across multiple games for a shot at making your payday even sweeter. Basketball's more fun when you're in on the action. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code GOODSEATS. New customers can get $200 in bonus bets instantly for betting just $5. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook with that code GOODSEATS. DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling by calling 888-789-7777 or visiting ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. Licensee partner, Golden Nugget, Lake Charles, Louisiana. 21 and over age varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. See sportsbook.draftkings.com/basketball for eligibility and deposit restrictions, terms, and responsible gaming resources. And now back to our conversation. Let's go back now because on a certain level, right? This seems it's a story about a well-known and well-regarded broadcaster in sports in New York, and arguably one of the modern deans, if you will, of an industry, right? But there's a whole story and a half, even way before that, right? It wasn't like Marty Glickman when he was a kid and in college was ordained to be one of the pioneers of New York sports broadcasting. Let's go back to a little bit of insight into his athletic career, his athletic prowess, and his academic interests, because a lot of interesting stuff happened to this guy before he even turned on a microphone in the Gotham area.
Sure, a lot happened, and a lot of things that people don't know that they'll learn about or have forgotten if they read this book. And my argument is that the study of sports is more than just who wins and loses, but whether you're allowed to play the game. But let me walk you through the early life of Marty Glickman and then some turning points that are very important. So
and by the way, leave a few surprises because we do want to sell a couple of copies of the book, for goodness sakes.
That would be nice. Wouldn't sure.
It? Yeah, we do our best here, so don't worry about that. We'll publicize.
The book is called Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend. And it is a book about a second-generation Jew, a child of immigrants, who's trying to make it in the American world, and all the turmoil and problems he had in trying to make it. So here's how the story begins. He grew up in Flatbush section of Brooklyn. He was a very fine athlete at James Madison High School in the Flatbush section. He ran track and he played football. In fact, when he was a senior, high school football was so big in Brooklyn that the championship game between James Madison High School and Erasmus Hall took place in Ebbets Field in front of 20,000 fans. And the highlight of the game was it was a game between Marty Glickman and Sid Luckman. Sid Luckman would go on to Columbia and become a professional football player. Glickman versus Luckman. It was a big game. And the game was not only in Ebbets Field, but if you went to a theater outside New York, it was recorded and shown as a newsreel clip. So again, your question about more than just New York, all over the country. In any event, he ends up although he has 14 schools after him, he's all city in track and all city in football. He is recruited to go to Syracuse University. And now it becomes a very interesting Jewish story. Why does he go to Syracuse? Because a group of alumni who are members of a Jewish fraternity called their Samis, S-A-M fraternity, recruit him, and they're going to pay his way because they believe that if we bring in an outstanding Jewish athlete, that will mitigate against the amount of quota system which was undermining Jewish life on campus there and all over the country. You imagine that? If this guy is so good, it's going to open the doors to so many other Jews. Now, it turns out that it's a quixotic attempt on their part. He does go to Syracuse. He has a great time there. He becomes a hero on campus, but it doesn't change the situation of other Jews who are not admitted to Syracuse. So he's doing fine. In fact, not only that, we're speaking now at the end of the Jewish holidays. He absents himself from practice on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, much like the often told story of Hank Greenberg, and he's accepted. Everything's going well. He qualifies for the 1936 Berlin Olympics on the track team, and he's going to run with Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalf, and others. And he goes to Berlin, Hitler's games in 1936, and he gets to the Olympic Village, and again, he's treated very well. As I talk to you from my study, I'm looking at a picture from the Daily News of Marty Glickman chowing down with the great runner Glenn Cunningham. He's part of the group. He knows Yiddish, so when he sees Nazi guards in the Olympic Village, he's able to talk to them. He makes fun of them. Then he takes a ride. He wants to go with a friend of his named Herman Goldberg, who is on the baseball team, the American baseball team. They take a ride and they go to the Olympic Stadium to watch the events. And this Wehrmacht driver is so thrilled to have these guys, he asked for their autograph. So they scribbled their names so they couldn't make out that they were Jews. Everything's going great, Tim. He's accepted. He's allowed to play. And then things turn a day before the big race. He's supposed to be in the 4x100 meter relay race, one of the last events in the Olympic Stadium, in front of 80,000 fans, including fans named Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, and others. And the day before the race, the managers, the coaches come in to the locker room and they say, we heard a rumor that the Germans were hiding some really great runners. And again, Glickman was no slouch, nor was Sam Stoller, the other Jew on the team. So Glickman and Stoller, you're out. Jesse Owens, you're going to run along with Ralph Metcalf. Why they do it? Because the instigator for this is a man named Avery Brundage. Remember that name because he has great significance in terms of the Olympics. He is an American Nazi, and he doesn't want to embarrass his friends who are in the stands. So Glickman and Stoller are out. Jesse Owens jumps up and says, hey, listen, I have 3 gold medals. I don't need a 4th gold medal. And the managers, the coaches say, boy, sit down and shut up. So Marty Glickman never gets a chance to run in the Olympics. I have to tell you, there was a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Race. And they depict this story, but they don't depict it accurately. In the movie, they show the Americans winning the race by 50 yards or more. And then they show a guy playing Marty Glickman coming out of the stands and embracing Jesse Owens, and they're jumping up and down and they're chanting USA, USA. Tim, this didn't happen. Glickman was left in the stands alone while the Americans won the race. And to make things worse, after this event, the American newspapers and the American Jewish newspapers hardly mention what happened to Glickman and Stoller. They're captivated by the fact that Avery Brundage goes after a female swimmer named Eleanor Jarrett, who committed the terrible sin of hosting a cocktail party on the SS Manhattan on the way to Germany. He is alone. He is marginalized at that point in time. So this is a metaphor of how Jews were treated in America in the interwar period. And by the way, things are worse for Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens comes back to America. They have a ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue, and then they have a celebratory dinner at the Waldorf Astoria, and the prime feature is Owens, except he has to go up the back elevator to get to the ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria. And let me go on one other story about 1936. He comes back to America. He's getting ready to go for his sophomore year at Syracuse, and he has a Gentile friend who invites him to work out of the New York Athletic Club on Central Park South in Manhattan. And Glickman shows up with his gym satchel. He gets to the door, and he's turned away because no Jews are allowed in the New York Athletic Club. You know, Tim, when he becomes famous many years later, the New York AC begs him to join the New York AC, but he won't. And he experiences anti-Semitism again. And I want to tell you, if you don't mind, a short personal story. My dad was a wrestler, an amateur wrestler. And this is not in the book, but I'm telling your audience this. And he was a wrestler for the 92nd Street YMHA, which was a Jewish club. And one of their meets was against the New York Athletic Club. And when my father wrestled against the New York AC, he helped himself to what we called in the family the purloined towel. He stole a towel as a souvenir that as a Jew, he had been at the New York Athletic Club. Sadly, when my parents passed away, we misplaced the towel. But I put that together with Marty Glickman's story, tells us a lot about the nature of Jewish life during this time period. But it's not the only time that Glickman dealt with marginality, which was very common for that time period.
Yeah, I look at that entire story. And Brundage, right, is an enigma wrapped in a mystery himself. But I mean, this was no sort of isolated incident. I mean, this is a guy who in the mid 1930s, when things were brewing in Europe, right? I mean, he was part of the German American Bund organization, which essentially was sort of, if you will, kind of a Nazi sort of sympathizing group in the U.S. and America first, kind of.
Avery Brundage was part of he spoke at a Bund rally in Madison Square Garden. He was I'm not making this up. He was identified as as an American Nazi, as were some of the other coaches on the team. No question about it.
Yeah,
and by the way, Glickman always said this is not a Holocaust story because nobody died, but he said it was a prequel to the Holocaust because it's talked a lot about where Jews were in the mind of America, and nobody stood up for Marty Glickman or Sam Stoller, and it was something that was emblematic of the difficulties Jews had during that time period. So again, it's a sports book, but it's also a book about American Jewish life. And if you have no interest in sports, you should have interest in the book from the perspective of, look, at the end of the day, I am a sports fan, but I've been a professor for almost 50 years of American Jewish history, and I can teach Glickman in my courses to my students.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you also mention in the book, and I don't want to give away too much more of it, right? Because it's an excellent read, but you do mention an event later, years later. Marty Glickman is back in Germany, and you kind of set it up as like he almost had, I want to say, made peace, I guess, with what happened during the Olympic Games, but he was somewhat pretty quick to kind of have all those memories flood back upon going back, and perhaps almost made him feel a bit more resolute about sort of how he had been mistreated and misjudged in that moment in time, and perhaps not even coming to grips with sort of really what transpired.
In 1985 and then 1986, 1985, he's invited back to Berlin as part of a documentary that's being done about Jesse Owens. And he goes to the Olympic Stadium, and I shouldn't say he has an aha moment. He has a moment which sears his being, where he walks into that stadium and he looks up at the place where Hitler and his friends sat, and he says to himself, I'm here, okay? I'm reliving this terrible experience. I'm alive and they're not. And then a year later, 1986, the Giants are playing a preseason football game. Today the NFL plays in Europe, but this was a preseason game. And I forget who the Giants were playing. And the Mara family invites Glickman to come back. And again, he has this experience. And as a result of this, it's clear that he becomes more than an announcer and more than an athlete. He becomes a teacher. And in the last 15 years of his life, one of the things he does, he hooks up with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he travels the country talking about his experiences and experiences of Jesse Owens, who's gone by then. And he sees himself trying to teach the next generation of what happened in the 1930s. So for me, it's an educational piece as well, piggybacking on Glickman's experience. Something happened a couple of weeks ago that's not in the book, but I want to share it with you and my audience. As this book was getting ready to be published, I sent a copy of the galleys, they're called ARC today, to a young rabbi in Los Angeles, California. And he's a conservative rabbi who's the rabbi of a very large congregation. He'll be very, very famous. Any event, he was invited by the USC track team to talk about anti-Semitism. Listen to this. Before this team went on to Auschwitz on a consciousness-raising tour. It's in July or early August of 2023. And I'm so proud of the fact that he takes with him a copy of my book, which had not yet come out. And he talks about Marty Glickman and what happened to him. And the punchline is, in 1936, one of the track coaches who sidelines Glickman and Stoller is the track coach of Norman Cromwell of USC. And now in 2023, they're going to Auschwitz to raise their consciousness. So things are difficult right now in America, but look how things changed. And I think of all the things that are in the book. And again, this is not in the book because it just recently happened. I'm very proud of the fact that this young rabbi used my work to educate people about what transpired during these very dark days. Again, it's a prequel. It's only 1936, but it has resonance for later on in American Jewish history and, of course, Holocaust history. And he becomes a teacher as well as a broadcaster. So I know this was a point of pride for him that he was involved in that sort of activity. And
yeah, look, and even in his career, right, he became kind of a teacher, if you will, almost de facto, mentor-like, right? Not even in the profession per se, but guiding and helping people, especially as he got more name recognition and becoming more honored, if you will, in the field.
100%. You know, it's a cutthroat industry, and everyone I spoke to about Glickman said, you know, I'm a bit of a jaundiced guy. I'm waiting for someone to say something negative. They're all saying in his cutthroat business, he was someone who gave of himself. He was also a mentor to former athletes, more than just Bill Walton, who now proliferate on the NFL games. He was a tutor to these people. Then he became a professor of broadcasting at Fordham University, which is about a mile away from where I'm speaking to you in the Bronx, New York. So he did all these things. At the end of the book, I tell a story about Bob Costas. Again, like Marv Albert, one of his key disciples. In 2012, by that time, Marty Glickman was gone for 11 years. You might know this story, but it's worth repeating. The Israeli national team at the Olympics, at the London Olympics, and the London Jewish community very much wanted the Olympic people to recognize the fact that 40 years earlier, 11 Israeli athletes were murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And not incidentally, after one day of mourning, hardly mourning, Avery Brundage, who's now the head of the International Olympic Committee, says the games must go on. And the reaction of the Olympic Committee which has never been very favorably disposed towards Israel, or said, no, we won't do this. And I think they didn't want to alienate some of the Arab countries. Anyway, as the story goes, as Bob Costas was the anchor of the opening ceremonies, when the teams marched in, when the Israeli teams marched in, he went off his script and said, ladies and gentlemen, here comes the Israeli team. Let's remember what happened to them 40 years ago. And after 10 seconds of saying that, they cut his voice and he went to a commercial. But he did say what had to be said. And I write in the book, Projection, that had Marty Glickman been still alive, he'd be awfully proud that one of his guys, Bob Costas, who came from Long Island, who listened to his games like I did, who's not Jewish, he's of Greek American extraction, and today he's one of the leading broadcasters, stood up strongly in support of what happened to the Israeli athletes. And as far as Avery Brundage is concerned, I also want you to know that on vacation last year, I read a marvelous biography of Jim Thorpe, the great Native American runner, which was written by a Pulitzer Prize author named David Marinis. And in 1912, he was the greatest athlete of that era. And he won some gold medals at the Stockholm Games. And then subsequently, they discovered, in quotation marks, that he had played a little bit of semi-pro baseball, and he was stripped of his medals. One of the people who was the instigator of Jim Thorpe losing his medals was none other than the young Avery Brundage. So here, Avery Brundage, 1912, 1936, 1972. And that's important for people to recognize and realize as part of this Olympic, again, the Olympic story that needs to be told. I should tell you that the last Olympics, they finally recognized 50 years after the murder of the Israeli athletes, what had happened at that point. So that's an important point that I make in the book. And again, I'm sharing with you post Glickman's life, some of the things, some of the ramifications of his activity.
Yeah, look, and it makes it an enormously deeper and more important story. But let me ask you this then: how do we connect the dots here? Because that's a life in and of itself, and he's not even, if you will, out of college, right? How does a guy like that, as a star athlete and having gone through all of that, how does sportscasting become, if you will, his calling? Because I don't think it was obvious. And frankly, it was, how much of a quote unquote industry was it at that point? Not a whole lot.
Well, certainly basketball was just starting. Well, let's go back a step. He has his first opportunity to try out as a broadcaster while he's still at Syracuse. One game against Cornell University, back then was a powerful team. He was a star player and he wins the game. I think he intercepts a ball and goes back for a touchdown. So a local haberdasher in Syracuse has this post-game show. He says, you know, we could use you on the air. We'll give you $15 and you'll do the post-game show of some other sports. That was his first opportunity. After serving in the Marines during World War II, he comes back and he chooses to broadcast pro basketball when it's just starting out. The BAA, which is a form. Let's go back one more step. You have broadcasters who do horse racing. You have people who are doing baseball. I mentioned Red Barber. But pro football and pro basketball were really minor types of activities. He convinces his people at WHN Radio, which then becomes WMGM. He, in his career, he broadcasted for HAM, WOR, WCBS. He got around. Anyway, so when the NBA starts, and this is in many respects as sad a story for me as the Olympic story. His great dream is to be a nationally recognized broadcaster. And in the first year of the BAA and the NBA, he in fact does the game of the week. A year later, he's taken off that post because the heads of the NBA, who had 1 or 2 rooms in the Empire State Building, this is a small time activity, feel that Americans don't want to hear Marty Glickman because he sounds too much like, I always say, like me, a New York Jew. So he's marginalized again. But the saddest part about this is that the people who take him off the national game are also Jews. The president of the NBA was Maurice Podoloff, and the prime publicist was Haskell Cohen, and they lack the confidence that people in Peoria will be interested in hearing a New York Jewish voice. He never gets a chance to do that, except 40 years later, he becomes a mentor to so many people who will be on the national broadcast. I want to ask you a question. Did you ever hear of a fellow named Isor Danilovich?
I sense this is a trick question, but no.
It's a trick question, yes. Okay. Who's Isor Danilovich? That's Kirk Douglas, who changes his name because he realizes that Isor Danilovich will not play well in Hollywood. He also says in a whimsical manner, he says, it would be hard to have on the marquee the name Isor Danilovich. Now, later in his life, Kirk Douglas regretted the fact that he had changed his name. So one of the things I argue in the book, another aspect of the American Jewish experience, of the minority experience, of the immigrant experience, is people changing their names in order to be accepted in America. And I interviewed Sal Marciano, as well as his daughter, Sam Marciano, who Marty mentored. And I told him about the experience with Marty Glickman. They want him to change his name from Marty Glickman to Marty Manning, and he wouldn't do it. And Marciano says to me, he laughs and says, when I was starting out, having grown up in the Italian section of Red Hook, Brooklyn, people want him to change his name because Sal Marciano was too Italian. As he progressed in the industry, he met one of his own heroes, Frank Sinatra, who said, I'm very proud of the fact that you didn't change your name. So name changes and how you sound on the radio or television back then was a determining factor. Today, it's not nearly the problem, but it bespeaks the situation of Jews and other minorities in America. And again, a cutthroat business, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's early television, or in our case, the broadcasting of sports. So again, I'm grateful for Marty Glickman because I can use him to help fit my understanding of the proper way to teach about sports in America. I want to reiterate it. It's not so much who wins or loses. It's rather if you're allowed to play the game. And how did I get into this whole thought process? When I was a graduate student 50 years ago at Columbia University, I was privileged to study with a great African-American scholar named Nathan Huggins. And he used to say, for minority groups, sports are a community-defining situation. He said, wars and sports define community. And of course, for him, the metaphor was the beginning of the civil rights movement when Jack Roosevelt Robinson's allowed to play Major League Baseball. It's a defining moment in terms of how African Americans are seen in America. 2 years before Harry S. Truman desegregates the armed forces. So the Black experience in America, much worse than the Jewish experience in this country. But by the same token, you can use that metaphor in terms of understanding Glickman's own experience. And one more quick story. When he comes back to Syracuse after the Olympics, he's on the football team, and they have a road game against the University of Maryland. And there is an African-American player on the Syracuse team. His name is Wilmeth Singh. His mother was Indian. His father was black. And Singh is taken off the team because Maryland, being a border state, the Syracuse club felt that the fans would be uncomfortable watching this outstanding running back. And Glickman in his memoirs says, I feel very bad for myself and very bad for Singh because I didn't stand up the way that Jesse Owens did. And sadly, during World War II, Singh is killed in action. And Glickman would say he wasn't American enough to play football, but he was American enough to give his life for his country. So wars and sports. And again, this book, for all the things we talked about earlier about how popular he was with people of my generation, I had the opportunity to project him as emblematic of so many other aspects of the American Jewish experience.
Very interesting. There's so much other stuff that we didn't, really even talk about. I mean, he was in the late 40s and most of the 1950s. He was basically the sports guy for the, if you can remember back in the day, newsreels. That was sort of like where sports kind of lived and stuff, right? And for Paramount, and that almost begat sort of the broadcasting career that we all sort of know and remember from the New York side. But he was also doing. He was a sports director for WCBS Radio. I mean, he was involved in the early days of HBO and their initial foray into sports.
Right.
People forget HBO, right? In the early days, they had to put stuff on the air, so they were putting stuff on like World Team Tennis and all kinds of other stuff. Roller, you name it, right? And so, I mean, in many respects, this is a multifaceted story and a guy who is very dimensional. And I think it's if you're not from New York, this is if you just have a passing interest in broadcasting or sports and culture and sports in the American story and the hodgepodge of the American experience. I mean, it's all of those things in one, and it's not an easy task, I think, but I think you've done it quite well and quite readably too.
Thank you. It was it was a great experience for me. I'm privileged to write many books, but this is the one that captured my heart as well as my mind very, very strongly. And I hope people get a chance to read it and learn from it. That would make me feel really good. I guess the last thing I want to say is I never met Marty Glickman, but I almost did. A few weeks before he died, he was going to be honored by the American Jewish Historical Society, and I was the chair of the academic council. And since I was known to be their sports guy, I was supposed to introduce Marty Glickman, but he didn't show up. He was too sick, and then sadly he passed away. So this is not necessarily a feel-good book. It's a serious book, and it raises some very important issues. But in a way, I feel that as a result of this, I can say in a 250-page book some of the things I would have said to Marty Glickman if he had shown up that way. So I think Marty Glickman's legacy lives on through his achievements, through his disciples and his grand disciples, right? Albert's children, they know the stories of Marty Glickman, and he's an important figure, both in the terms of the history of broadcasting, popular culture, but also American Jewish history, which is very satisfying to me as an author. And I'm glad to have done this book.
All right. Our thanks to Professor Gurock and the book that I highly recommend to go deeper into the story and the life of this amazing athlete / broadcaster, Marty Glickman. It's a wonderful read. It's called Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend. It is available now wherever fine books are found. It is published by our friends at the New York University Press. And you can, of course, get it from our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 323, and you will find a convenient couple of links to this book. You'll be whisked away to Amazon, where you can get the hardcover or audiobook, Audible version, whichever you choose, right there for you. And we appreciate it. We'll get a couple of shekels of referral love when you do so through that pathway. Of course, you can get the book wherever you ever find it. You want to find it at your local bookstore, support your local bookseller. By all means, go and do that. Just get the book. But the easiest, laziest way, of course, is to go through our website. While you're there, just tool around. You'll find all of our other episodes. We post them all there for you. Of course, subscribe and follow us wherever you get podcasts. That's the best way to ensure that you get every single episode of the show. Follow us, why not, also on social media. You'll find us on X/Twitter at Good Seats Still, and the various other social media places. You'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. By the way, when you go to our website and search up this episode, we'll also post a couple extra links there too. We'll post a link to the documentary film from 2013 that was on HBO called Glickman, written and directed by James Friedman, an excellent view, in our humble opinion. And we'll also post a link to the aforementioned book by David Halberstam called Sports on New York Radio, a play-by-play history, not only for the exploits of Marty Glickman, but also the influence that Marty Glickman had on at least two generations of sports broadcasters that came after him. That's a great book to delve into all of that. You can send us email if you'd like, hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Please, by all means, do so and keep it clean and keep it nice. We appreciate that. And let's see, let's also say another prayer for our good friend down in Atlanta, Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. As you know, longtime listeners of the show know, he has been with us since episode number 1, and he is the guy that makes all of our pieces sound coherent and somewhat cogent each and every week, and we can't do this show without him. And we just want to send him a little love because he's still mourning the fact that the Atlanta Braves won over 100 games this season in the regular season, and much like all the other 100-plus win teams, didn't last very long this year. So our condolences again to Jerry and to all of those great baseball fans out there who thought for sure that their dominant regular seasons were going to mean something in the postseason, and unfortunately not the case. Thank you, of course, for listening. We always appreciate it, and we appreciate your cards and letters, as they say. And until next week, we'll see you. Bye-bye.